Zoom recording. Hi, everybody. I think we're just going to wait one more minute to see if we can get a couple more folks on the line, and then we'll start.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I think we can start, and if there are any others that are going to be joining us, they can just pop in and join when they join. But thank you, everybody, for joining us for our final session as part of the African Scholars Webinar Series. Today, we will be talking about how to write a good randomized evaluation funding proposal. And we're very, very lucky to have two fantastic people on the line today. So we have Emily, who was the previous director of DigiFI and is currently working as part of DigiFI Africa in more of the teaching at the right level team. And then we also have Gabe Tarek on the line as well, who is our postdoc at DigiFI. So he's working under Tavneet Suri as part of his postdoc at MIT. And he did his PhD at Harvard. So we're very lucky to have these two with us today. We welcome them. All right, how do I get to the next slide? There we go. All right, so just to give you an overview of what we have done so far as part of the webinar series. So if you've been with us for the other sessions, you would have known that we've gone through thinking about kind of the research question and how to make a good randomized evaluation, kind of thinking about design, thinking about why we would evaluate, thinking about sample size and power. And now we're thinking about, okay, once we've got our idea together, how do we package it in a way that is appealing to people reviewing the application so that one is successful as part of the funding application process for that research funding. And yeah, so you can kind of see here what the outline is. So we'll have Gabe taking us through kind of what a good randomized evaluation funding proposal looks like, then thinking specifically at kind of what DigiFI looks like. So what we look for in a funding proposal and kind of the elements that one would need to include as part of that sort of application. And then Emily will take us through some sort of additional writing and some tips and tricks. And we'll sort of sum up with some Q&A. If you have questions, you can do so. So if you do have questions, that's just something to note. You can pop them in the chat box. And we will come back to those at the end of the session. Yeah, and then just a couple of housekeeping rules. If you could keep yourself on mute for while the speakers are talking, just so that we can all hear them. And yeah, just to note that the session is recorded, just as a point of clarity on that. So I would like to now hand over to Gabe, who will be taking us through kind of what a good randomized evaluation funding proposal looks like.
Great. Hi, everyone. So first, I'll be talking about what a proposal looks like in terms of looking for how to best design a proposal that would study a randomized evaluation, and talk a little bit about ideas that fit under the DigiFI initiative and what the initiative, what sort of projects the initiative is looking to support. So a broad overview of what Emily and I will be talking about with respect to this topic. We'll talk first about what makes a good research project idea. Then how do you develop an idea that has a clear pathway to a randomized evaluation? DigiFI is looking to support projects that are answering interesting questions, and often that requires starting out doing exploratory research, mapping the space and understanding the different interests of stakeholders and the different challenges in a particular context. But we're also really looking to support projects that in the end can test a particular intervention through a randomized experiment. I'll talk a little bit about the application guidelines, which may be familiar from other funding applications that you've done, but there are some differences here, mostly relating to these projects needing to fit the criteria relevant to a randomized evaluation. So things like power calculations that you saw in the previous webinars. And then finally, Emily will talk in more detail about how to write proposals in a simple and clear way. So first, let's start off talking about what you would cover in your proposal. So these are broad sets of questions about what goes into the proposal, but I think they're important to just help you clarify what questions you're hoping to answer and how to communicate that clearly to the board that would be considering the application for funding. So the proposal needs to address 3 sets of questions. The first is the what set of questions, and these relate to the topic that you're studying. And specifying first the research question that you hope to answer. So having a very clear and clearly communicated research question regarding what question in the space of digital identification or digital finance you're trying to answer. And once you have that question specified, it's clear what you're testing or what you're trying to answer. You want to ask whether this is actually a new contribution. Is this research worth doing? What is your contribution to the academic literature or policy literature? Maybe it's clear that the relationship that you want to test or the question you want to test has been answered in some theoretical sense by others, but it hasn't been tested in practice, or in a particular context, it's not clear whether the existing consensus on this question would apply to a particular setting. So making sure that what you're actually going to set out to answer could be useful to either other academics or policymakers. And then it's worth thinking through what are your expected findings. So if you have a very precisely defined, nice research question, but the results of that research question or what you expect to find aren't very clear or won't be able to be tested, then that might be a problem. So even if you're able to define a clearer question, understanding what you hope to find as a result of setting out to answer this question is important, and it will help you redefine the question in the first place to make sure that you can identify outcomes that you can measure appropriately, or that you'll be able to answer the question in the real world. The second set of questions relates to the why of the proposal. So this is essentially, why is this question interesting? And this relates somewhat to what I talked about, this being a contribution or a new set of new results that could be useful to academics or policymakers. But I think this set of why questions sharpens that in a more policy or real world sense. So you want to think about whether your research question is really important. Is this the most impactful question you could be asking in this setting? Or is there a bigger question that you could try to get at by expanding your question or thinking about how to formulate it differently? And then another question I think it's always useful to ask yourself is, why isn't this answer obvious? So if you ask the question and it seems like something that could be easily answered through common sense or existing evidence, then I think you may feel that this question isn't worth asking, or investing a lot of research resources in answering this question isn't necessary. So I think this is an important way to set a standard for yourself to develop questions that can shed new light or generate new knowledge that can be useful to others. And I think this is not always like, maybe the question you're asking is obvious. Like it seems clear that some program that you're proposing to evaluate should have positive impacts, and others have suggested that that would be true, but no one has tested it in the real world. And I think that's a case where the answer might appear obvious, but we don't have any empirical evidence on that question. And in that case, I think it's still worth testing and asking. And that would be a motivation that you would put into the proposal, saying, it's clear this question seems obvious, but we don't have any evidence on it. So I want to test this question and show that it holds in my particular setting. And maybe if it doesn't hold, then that would be a useful result that could like suggest why asking this question in the first place is important. The final set of questions is the how questions. And this is where you get into the more nitty-gritty details of, okay, I have a nice, interesting research question. It's very important, but how do I take this abstract question and bring it down to the real world and implement it? And how do I think through the procedures and designs that would help me ensure that I can answer this question? So as researchers, we're always first concerned about how we answer questions with data. So if you have a nicely defined research question, the next step is ensuring that you can answer that research question. So how do I take this exercise or this question that I want to answer and answer it with data? That could be proposing to collect survey data from households or other individuals that would be impacted by a particular program or some intervention. Or it could be relying on administrative data that is generated through like government records or other sets of records. So ensuring that you can actually measure the outcomes of the research question you want to study is important. And then second, the empirical strategy is very important. So to make sure that you can identify the impact of the intervention or program that you're evaluating clearly. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this when we get to the set of slides on randomized evaluations. But in this case, if you're conducting a randomized evaluation, it's pretty clear how you would proceed regarding identifying the causal impact of an intervention or program. But if you're at more earlier stages in the research, like developing a pilot proposal, there you might not have the ability to conduct a full-scale RCT that would provide nice, clean causal evidence. So then you need to think about, how can I generate what would be my best shot at giving a causal estimate of a pilot program when I can't run an RCT or I don't have sufficient sample. And there, I think it's really important to think through how you will evaluate the results of some pilot research or smaller scale study that would inform the development of a larger RCT. And there you might need to be creative in thinking about empirical strategies, whether it's relying on more quasi-experimental strategies applied to administrative data or past data, or using like cross-sectional survey data and making assumptions about what this data would look like in a larger sample, or if like conservatively what you would think the impact of the program would be if you made some assumptions about the potential impact according to evidence from other settings or other sets of literature. And then finally, as I said, I'll talk about this in a few slides, but how you need to think about how this would lead to a randomized evaluation. So maybe you have a very nicely defined research question, you've thought through the whys, and you think this question would be important, and you've thought through how you would find the appropriate data to answer this question. But it seems really unlikely that it could lead to a full randomized evaluation. Maybe you're working with a government partner who's willing to experiment to study a question in 2 different schools that they have set aside for this evaluation, but they will never agree to scale up the study to a larger randomized evaluation. So you need to think through whether going down that path will allow you to do a larger study in the end, or if there might be logistical or administrative constraints on your ability to pursue or develop the research idea further. So now I'll talk a little bit about what DigiFI specifically looks for in their research proposal, both in terms of what a good research idea looks like, but also some of the application guidelines and like topic areas of interest that are more specifically tailored towards DigiFi. So the first topic here is looking for good research project ideas. And what's important here is to identify things that are first academically interesting. And so we talked a little bit about this on the previous slide, but you want to make sure that you're making a contribution to the literature or the policy space in a meaningful way. And when we think about things that are policy relevant, these are things that are addressing a question in a particular context that could be readily adopted or applied by government partners or people in the private sector that are looking for evidence that can inform their decisions. I think that's often a contextual question, what is interesting to people, and I think, or government partners. And finding that out, I think it's best achieved through conversations, talking through potential partners and asking them what they're interested in finding an answer to, and or proposing things that could be useful to them and finding out whether they would be interested in answering that question as well and partnering in research. And then third, the research project idea that you would propose to DigiFi, if you find a good and interesting idea that's policy relevant, would have to fit within the space of those types of projects that we'd be looking to fund. And so the best source of information here is the DigiFi framing paper, which has a lot of detail about the questions that this initiative is, was developed to support answering. And broadly, they fall in the space of digital identification and digital finance. So we're looking to support projects that look at initiatives that have developed new forms of identification that are based on biometrics or digital forms, and how those new forms of identification can be linked to government payments or payments by individuals to government, or even payments and financial transactions or interactions in the private sector. So there's a lot of detail in the framing paper, and I encourage you to read that closely, both to understand what types of projects we're looking for, but it also will give you a grounding in the literature that's out there in these spaces. So you can learn about other people who have already worked on these topics and might give you useful ideas in developing your own research. And then finally, as I said before, the idea that you develop should be one that appears like that it could be eventually turned into an RCT. So an idea that could be scaled in a way to test a particular intervention and evaluate the causal impact of that through a randomized design. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the following slides. Okay, so the next topic here is talking in more detail about this pathway to a randomized evaluation. And here we're looking for projects that could be developed into a larger intervention in the future, a larger RCT design in the future. So what this means in practice is there needs to be an intervention or a program or a planned intervention that's described as part of the proposal. So often we can develop like interesting research questions about things that are unknown or uncertain in the space of even digital finance and biometric identification, whether asking questions about, or factual questions about the usefulness of identification, or whether like a particular existing system of digital finance is working. But that might not necessarily lend itself towards evaluating a new intervention or a planned intervention. I think those types of more qualitative research questions are interesting and useful, but can be more easily answered by just running a survey to collect data from individuals or analyzing existing data, and wouldn't necessitate funding that would support a larger study. So just in terms of efficiency, you could answer those questions by just collecting existing data or doing short surveys. But here we're looking to identify research projects that could test new interventions to improve or overcome challenges that exist in this space. So you need to find an intervention or a change in existing policy or practice that could be evaluated that would help us answer the question of whether this new form of approaching a particular question works or whether it doesn't work, or it could be evaluating an existing system and testing whether that existing approach or existing intervention works. But there needs to be a clear policy or intervention that you're evaluating. And I'll just say that for the pilot proposals, which Emily will talk in a little bit more detail about, there needs to be some buy-in, showing that the implementing partner would be interested in scaling this up towards a larger randomized evaluation. So if you're at the pilot stage, just collecting information about a particular question, trying to understand the context and engage partners in conducting a pilot to see whether at a first pass, some intervention appears to have positive or negative effects, or just to identify what does the impact of this intervention look like before running a larger randomized evaluation. You want to find a partner or find a situation in which it looks like the intervention that you want to evaluate could be scaled up to a larger RCT. And this often means that you're going to be asking questions about sample size and scale, as well as funding. So the DigiFI initiative is intended to support these RCTs, but often there might be costs that will be associated with running intervention that would need to be borne by the implementing partner. So you would need to have conversations about whether that partner is willing to allocate staff time towards running the intervention within their organization or monitoring it in particular ways. Moving from a pilot to a larger randomized evaluation often entails lots of logistical discussions, as well as those related to sample size and power calculations that you saw in the previous webinar. Okay, then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the application guidelines for DigiFI grants. And here, I think the best thing I can do is point you towards the RFP application documents. And there you'll find a lot of detail about what goes into the type of applications that we are soliciting. But in a broad sense, they will describe the main question, the research questions, the interventions. And then there's more detail requested about power calculations, budgets, and timelines. And there it's just really important to fill in all the information you can and be as succinct and clear as possible when filling those in. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to Emily to talk in more detail about the types of grants that are available.
Great, thanks so much, Gabe. Great, so just to share with all of you. So first I want to say thank you so much for joining. It's so exciting to have all of you on the line. I wish that we were all meeting in person. I would love to get to know each of you. As Amy mentioned at the beginning, I worked with Amy to help set up DigiFI last year and have 6 months ago or so turned it over to Nidhi, who is a wonderful leader, and she and Amy are now developing the initiative that you all see now. And I think one of the things that they have done is try to create opportunities for scholars such as yourselves. So we're really, really excited to have you all on the line and want to support you in your careers, and are really excited to see ways that we can collaborate with you in that. So just a quick summary of the way in which DigiFI can do that. So right now we have a system where we can offer proposal development grants up to $10,000 and pilot grants up to $75,000. So first about the proposal development grants. These grants are meant for fairly initial scoping. So I think with all of these, it's best if you have a partner already and you can say, I have a relationship with this partner and I would like to do some initial scoping work to explore this. And this might be you're doing some initial qualitative research, for example, or you're working with the partner to understand their data better, or maybe you are doing some initial descriptive work, or even starting to figure out, is the intervention something that can be randomized and how might that all work? Secondly, maybe we can move to the pilots, Amy? Is the pilot grants, and those are up to $75,000. Sometimes this will be actually trying to start a system that could be tested for a full RCT. So this is quite a bit of money. So you can do some pretty intensive fieldwork, I think, depending on your context with this funding. And you could really get into the details of research and really start to do some exploratory fieldwork to figure out the intervention that you're exploring and to really get set up for a full-scale study. So we've listed here all of the pieces of things that you would need to include in your proposal under a pilot grant. The other piece of advice I'll give is that Amy and Nidhi have been very generous in their time. So as you're working on your proposals, you are welcome to reach out to them to do a call to discuss the pieces that you're going to include and to get their feedback. None of us on this call are on the selection committee, but all of us have experience with different committees. And so we can't give you any definitive advice, but we can be a sounding board for you as you work through these proposals to pull all of these pieces together. As you'll see, the pilot grants has more detail that you have to fill out, in part because they're meant to be a bigger grant and one that's closer to the running of a full-scale study. Great, now I'll share some just broad tips about writing in this next section. If you can go, yeah, perfect. So I have 6 tips about how to write good proposals. Many of these tips are broadly about writing. I'm sure many of you on this call would have additional tips for each other as well. So I won't go through, this is the summary of the 6 tips, but we'll go through them one by one. Great, so the first tip is to build a strong structure before you start writing. Really think about your main argument or your point from the beginning. Like, what is it that you want to convey to your audience? Think about this very deeply and make sure you highlight this point really clearly and early in your writing. Second is to build an outline of a piece before you start writing. I think this piece can be really useful. It can help you identify what your main topics are. It can help you figure out the flow of how those topics go together. And if you have someone to support you in your writing, I recommend sharing the outline with them so that they can help you think about your main points in that flow, even before you start putting sentences to those main points. Next is to really think about topic sentences and about your paragraphs. And this is a theme I'll come back to several times in this presentation. But I think one thing that has been helpful for me in my writing is to really think hard about each paragraph. What is the idea I'm trying to convey? And what is my topic sentence? And then having all the other sentences support that topic sentence. And making sure to switch to a new paragraph whenever you switch to a new topic. Great. The second tip is to use a clear title for your proposal. We've shared some titles that we've liked, that we've seen as the DigiFI initiative here. You'll see that many of them are very catchy. Remember that your title is the first time that the reviewers will engage with your work. So it's a great chance to make a very good, very good first impression, and to be clear about what you want to do. So I love some of these titles, such as Call Me Maybe, but you can think about cute ways to name your title, but I think the most important thing is that your title is clear and it hints at what you're going to do in your research. And so it leaves the audience wondering what it is you're going to do and how you're going to do it, but it does that in a way that gives them some preview to that, even in just a few short words. Next slide, please. Great. So the next tip has to do with citing related literature. So Gabe spoke to this a bit, but it's very important that you help the reviewer see how your research will contribute to the field. So part of that is you need to show them what is the area of the field that you're working on and how does your research advance that area of the field. Remember that the reviewers often know the literature in this area quite well. So you're going to have to be quite careful about how you summarize that research, which research you pull in, and how you cite the research. So make sure that you focus on research that's really closely related to the topic that you're working on, rather than just broadly in that field at all. Make sure that you use your own words as you summarize that research. I think the easiest way to ensure you do not get funding is by plagiarizing. And so if the reviewers read something and they think, I don't know if this person wrote this thing or not, first of all, it's very easy to Google a sentence and figure out if somebody else actually wrote that sentence rather than you. And second of all, any hint that maybe you took it from someone else is a very, very scary thing in academia. So instead, what you should do is make it very clear when you are summarizing someone else's work and when you are adding a new idea above and beyond that other person's work. And of course, you can always directly quote other people's work so long as that you put it in quotations and make it clear that it came from them and not from you, and you cite them as you do that. Our final point on this is to not be overly negative. We think that there's ways to do this professionally. Certainly you can disagree with the conclusions that other people came to, but you can do that by saying that you're complementing their idea in some way, or you're building on their idea, or even that you're contradicting their idea in some way, but do that professionally rather than trying to tear apart other people's work. Then next slide is to, the fourth tip is to use clear and concise language. So one thing that I'm guilty of often is using superlatives. Often when I read my writing later, I'll say things like, this is very important, or this is extremely beneficial, or this is highly something, or very, or really, deeply. And none of these words add any value to your writing. So as soon as you're tempted to write a superlative, you should cut it out of your sentence. Because it's actually not adding any value, and it decreases the value that the words, the rest of the sentence has. So often I'll go back through my writing and cut these words out after I've written them. Another tip is we often see people write with the word this. So for example, in many of the proposals that DigiFI gets, they'll see things like a sentence that says, this indicates that ... It's unclear often what that this refers to. So one thing we recommend is just making sure if you're going to say this, that you have a noun after it. So maybe you say this evidence indicates that. So you're clear what it is you're referring to as you use the word this. And then finally, and you'll see this as a theme throughout, but really think about your paragraphs. Think about where the breaks are in your paragraphs, and think about the white space between your paragraphs. You usually don't want to have more than, or you usually want to have at least 2 paragraphs per page so that your paragraphs are quite short. And the more that you can use your paragraph structure to make your main points, the easier it will be for your reader to see what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. So next, I strongly encourage you to review your own proposal in much detail. When I write something, especially something that I'm going to submit, I will spend 20 or 30% of my time drafting the language in that proposal, and the remaining 70 to 80% of the time reviewing it. So I spend lots of time scrubbing the language and making it clearer. We've included in this slide some questions that you can ask yourself as you're working to make that writing clearer. And I encourage you to use this list as you write and to add your own questions to it, so you have a checklist that you go through as you try to review your writing. Another trick that sometimes I use is to read the topic sentences in your writing and nothing else. So you don't read the extra sentences, you just read that very first sentence in each paragraph, and you see, can you understand the main points that you're trying to make, even without reading the extra detail? And if you can't, then you might want to think about how to rewrite your topic sentences so that they can stand almost by themselves without needing those extra sentences after them. Finally, a last hack here, you could read your paragraphs backwards, sentence by sentence, to keep you focused on the grammar. So that's a great way, after you have your content really strong, to then make sure you haven't made any grammatical mistakes, is to read the sentences out of context so you can see if there's any typos or grammatical errors. And finally, I can't emphasize this enough, but I recommend that you ask someone else to review your proposal. So ask someone that you trust, ask someone that you know to be a good writer. So you can ask people in your field to review for substance, and especially you could ask, like, how well am I citing this related literature? How well do you think that my idea adds to that literature, and so on, and so on. But you can also ask people who are not in your field for the clarity of writing. So I find that if you have a proposal, your language should be clear enough that even someone who does not know the literature at all should be able to understand what you're adding and what your methods are. So someone who has no background can really be a great check on that clarity. And finally, you might want to find a writing buddy. And I see that there's many people on this call, so maybe there's a way to reach out to others in this group or to others in your own academic setting to ask for help. And then you can make a team of you where you trade back and forth. And so they can review your proposal, but you can also review theirs. Great, so I'm going to end with bringing all of you in. So we've written an example, and what I would like to do is to read through this example and then ask you to unmute and give some advice on how to make this example stronger. So I'll ask you for ideas to how to improve the writing, including how to make the research piece clearer. So what is it that they're trying to do and what is the intervention? So I'm going to pause here and we will give you about a minute to read this paragraph. So on your own piece of paper, write down some ideas for how you would make this stronger, and then I'll open it up to the floor to shout out some of those suggestions. Great. Okay, I'm going to open it to the floor. Please unmute yourself and let us know if you have ideas of how to improve this paragraph. You're also welcome to raise your hand. There's a raise hand function on Zoom.
I can give it a try.
Hi there, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, I think the first sentence and the second sentence, I'm trying to bring a point out, but they like referencing to the literature where they got the information from. Yeah.
Great. And just to press on that for a second, what is the topic sentence of this paragraph? Is it the first sentence?
Yeah, I think so. The first sentence, yeah, because basically it's trying to look at financial inclusion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I always struggle to have discussions on Zoom, so everyone should be very aggressive about sharing your ideas here. Thank you so much for your contributions. Other ideas?
Sorry, can I come in here?
Yes, please.
All right, so I do think that at least looking at the sentence, the first sentence, and also the last sentence. So you're trying to find a way to increase savings and also access to bank accounts. But then at the same time, you're trying to find a way also to link that to digital IDs, which kind of leads me to that it might be an issue of financial literacy, right? So, and also how the better way to financial literacy to the people, at least people that do not understand financial inclusion much, especially in the rural areas. So I do think maybe a way to advance the knowledge about financial inclusion could also be financial literacy, but in this sense, trying to find a way of getting it closer to the poor people than before. So this could be maybe through not necessarily online training, but online games on financial literacy that can actually instigate that that desire to know more of how to do financial inclusion.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, given this paragraph and how it's written, what would you say is the intervention that they're doing here? Do you think that there's a clear intervention?
No.
Intervention is not clear.
This was deliberately meant to be a bad example where it's unclear to me of what the intervention is.
It seems to me they're trying to do more like a survey to find out more before actually doing an intervention. So at least that's what it seems to me just by reading it.
Yeah, and I think that the tone of both of your responses of, oh, it's hard to say, is something that sometimes when the DigiFI committee reviews proposals, they'll get proposals where they'll say it's hard to say what the intervention is and hard to say what the research plan is. And that's a good way for them to decide not to fund your study, right? If it's unclear to them what you're doing, it's really hard for them to say, yes, we want to put money behind this. So just that kind of clarity can be really helpful for the reviewers.
Sorry, but regarding that,
yep.
Let us, if we assume that this is like a pilot stage, right? So you don't even know what the intervention is, and it is unclear to you how you should actually plan the intervention because you're still trying to find out more about the scenario, the situation, right? So how would you go about kind of grafting it? Because you're still unclear, you have some hypothesis you want to test, but you're not sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say exactly what you just said. To say, here's the broad area I want to study. We're not sure yet of exactly what is the intervention here. Here maybe is a few examples of things that we're thinking about. And in our pilot, we're going to explore those examples using these research methods. We're going to do focus groups, or we're going to collect descriptive data. Here's the information that we have already, and here's the information that we're lacking. So you just say very clearly all those things, rather than kind of, this paragraph here is an example of something that's a bit muddled. And so just to be clear in the information that you know and the information you don't know yet, and your plan for getting that information.
Okay, so I don't know, maybe, I don't know. I guess I'm just asking so many questions, so I don't know what I'm allowed to.
No, it's great, thank you.
Okay. All right, so, but one thing regarding that, wouldn't that be more qualitative than actually quantitative? So it's almost as if you're trying to do like a qualitative study here regarding pilot, right? So if I do focus groups, I mean, is that something that, because my experience has been when you're more into qualitative investigations, you kind of get less selected, right? Because that's actually, it's kind of looked down upon if you put that way, say a certain extent in economics. So going that route, wouldn't that actually kind of put you in a bad spot?
Yes, so I have my answer to this, but then I would love to hear from Gabe as well. In my mind, qualitative work is useful and necessary, and I think economists do it, but they don't publish it very often. So usually you're doing qualitative work at the very, very, very beginning when you're trying to understand an issue, and then you're building towards doing a more rigorous study. And so I know that at JPEL, lots of the affiliated professors do qualitative work at the very beginning, but that's not the end goal. So they're not going to publish their qualitative work. They're going to use it to design towards their RCT. And so they help them unpack those initial ideas as they're building towards an RCT. Gabe or Nidhi, would you like to respond to the question about qualitative exploration here?
Sure. Yeah, I think qualitative work is always, always has to be part of even these projects that will end up becoming larger scale RCTs. It's just necessary to understand the context and really like get down into the details of how to design something or understand how to tailor a particular question to a particular context. But that doesn't mean that it always like appears in the publication that you read in the end, or that it's front and center in a lot of like the finalized research that you consume. And I think that's partly a somewhat unfortunate standard in economics, at least, that there's more emphasis on these like well-identified causal impacts. And I think I've heard some discussions about people like trying to develop a space for qualitative research itself to shine through. But I think those are two separate questions. Like the qualitative research is always important and necessary input, and then it might not always be reflected in the end output, but I think it's an essential input into the process of even designing these more like types of projects that are focused on causal estimation, like RCTs.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. I guess the main issue here is whether qualitative research will be funded when you're applying.
Okay. Nidhi, any answer to that?
Yeah, I think at a proposal development stage, we would be more than willing to have qualitative work because I think you're still understanding the problem. I think once it comes to the pilot stage, we're looking for a mix of quantitative and qualitative, and that's true for the RCT as well. So I think because we look at RCTs and we look at causal impacts, there's a large focus on quantitative methods, but we completely understand the importance of qualitative methods to understand mechanisms or to support the quantitative findings. So I would say qualitative is great as long as it comes with a very strong quantitative component.
All right, thanks a lot, yeah. Okay.
Great, I actually think that leads back into our example quite well. So I just want to highlight a few things from this example, and then I'm going to show you an example of something in my own writing to try to make something that's a good example of this. I'm sure there's still ways to improve. So back on this example here, so some things I wanted to highlight is that when I read this first sentence, it doesn't tell me anything about what is the intervention and what is the research I'm going to conduct, which should be the two main things about the paragraph here. Is you should be talking about what is it that you're going to do and what is it that somebody else is going to do. So it does tell you some background, but it doesn't tell you about what you're going to do. Another thing to highlight is that there's many superlatives throughout this paragraph. Financial inclusion is a big problem. We don't need to say the word big there. There's no need to have that word there. Or it's very needed. Or where else? Which is a very important topic. At the end, there's lots of extra words here that we could cut out to make this more clear. In addition, as we've discussed, there's no clear plan for what the research is. So it's unclear who's doing what from the implementation side, and it's unclear who's doing what from the research side. So I'm going to flip to an example. Oh, Amy, can you change to the next slide, please? So here's an example from our side of a paragraph which better has identified the research plan and the implementation. So in this paragraph, it starts with a main topic, or sorry, with a topic sentence that says what the research team is planning to do, and who the partner is, and what the government is planning to do, including saying how you're going to measure an outcome, all within that first topic sentence. And then it starts to give some of the background that was at the beginning of the last paragraph. And then in this example, so I really appreciated the question, we said that you would do some initial focus groups, so qualitative research to understand the experience, but then map how that's going to help you get to a randomized trial. So I think that it's very important that if in these initial stages, that the work that you're doing helps you see what is the pathway for doing a more rigorous research study down the line. And that's one thing that the reviewers often talk about is, what is it that you're helping to learn about here, and how does it contribute towards building your bigger project in the future? This example was just me making up examples. I'm sure there's many ways to make these things better. Just wanted to give you some substance to work through as you're thinking about how to put your proposals together. As you can see, it's completely a hypothetical example. All right, I'll turn it back to Amy and to run us through a question and answer session.
Great, thanks, Emily. Cool, so to give some time for questions, I just wanted to briefly take you through these other writing resources that we have. I'll be sharing these slides in an email after this presentation, so you'll have access to them and the various links that we've included. I'd also encourage folks to have a look at the JPAL website to see how the different affiliates and researchers that are within our network, how they write and how they present their published findings as well. Great, so now we have an opportunity to have a Q&A. While we're doing this, we'd really encourage you to fill in our feedback form that we've put together just on the series, so we can make improvements for next time. But yeah, now is an opportunity to kind of ask your questions. I see we haven't had too many questions come through the chat box, but if you have more questions, please pop them there. We do have one question that has come through, and that is asking about the budget and what should be considered when writing the budget section of your proposal. So maybe Nidhi, you could have a crack at answering what do we look for and consider when reviewing the budgets, and what should folks be thinking about?
So thanks, Amy, and thanks so much, Emily and Gabe. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed listening to both of you. On the budget considerations while writing an RCT proposal, it's a very good question because there isn't exactly a one-size budget that fits all projects, right? I think what we do look for is that first, that there are no implementation costs. JPAL is a research organization, and so we only fund research or evaluations of studies. So if you're looking at the impact of a digital ID system, we will not be able to fund what the actual implementation costs of a digital ID. So that's one big point, which I think can often lead to a bit of confusion. I think then other things that we look for in RCT are kind of the unit costs of things and how, whether the items make sense. So if you and these things will come organically and will hold through. I think often when you're putting together a budget, they're estimates, and they can be a little, they cannot be very true because you've not thought it through. So I would just advise to spend as much time as possible thinking through how much time you need from different people and what are the different costs that would be involved, and use those. You usually have to partner with an implementing organization when you're running an RCT. You usually have fixed unit costs. So a very common implementing organization we work with, which is a sister organization to us, is called IPA. And I would encourage you to look at maybe one of their budgets, look at their unit costs to give you a sense of how much it could cost to run an RCT. I think those are kind of the two broad things. The other one is, if you do want us to go through your budget beforehand, we are more than happy to do that and talk through that along with your proposal, as Emily mentioned. We really enjoy talking about research ideas with African scholars. And we also think we have a bit of sense of what the board is looking for. And we would love to be able to direct you in that direction. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nidhi. All right, so the next question that came through was just asking if we could share a sample funded proposal from DigiFI. Ooh, I don't know. Nidhi, do you have thoughts on this? my gut feeling would probably be no, just from privacy and sharing perspective. But Nidhi, thoughts on this?
I think we can try and do it. We would have to ask the people who wrote the proposal before we commit to this. So I would like to be optimistic, but I can't promise anything.
Great. We can definitely look into that. But I think it might, given that research is often quite sensitive as well, I don't know how happy people would be to share their proposals, but we can look into it.
Yeah, we could maybe try and find an old proposal where the research is already over, maybe not from DigiFI, but just an example of what a good proposal is.
True. Yeah, that's actually a good idea. Cool. Then there's another question about timelines for pilot grant applications. I'm not sure, do you mean the timelines for the actual project, or do you mean when the applications are due? So I can give you both answers. So pilots are generally about a year long, sometimes a bit longer as an actual project time. And then when it comes to the submitting applications for a pilot grant, we have 2 RFPs each year. So the next one, our RFP 2 closed in April. And then we have another one kind of in, probably will be July, August, September, sometime around then. Great. Cool. Then the final, so if there are any more questions, we have another 2 minutes, so you can keep them coming if you have more questions. The next question is, would you recommend partnering private organization or government institution? Nidhi, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure, thanks, Amy. I think it really depends on your question and who is implementing the product you're trying to test. But in general, I think we are a lot keener to work with governments. And one reason for that is they have a very wide scope and they reach a very large number of people. So the opportunity to test something at a large scale is really exciting for us. And they often also look at welfare outcomes or at the section of population which we are also interested in. So I would say we are more favorable towards government, but having said that, a lot of mobile money work happens through the private sector, and we would be thrilled to fund some of the evaluations on that. So think about who's the implementing organization and what the target population is and what the scale is, and you should be able to make out whether it's a good fit or not.
Great, thanks, Nidhi. All right, then there's another question about if we could talk more about the experimental research plan. I'm assuming you're talking about the proposed development research plan, or so I guess we want to kind of see a plan of what you're planning to do with the proposed budget. So what kind of activities you're going to be managing, who you plan to talk to, when things will be happening, and how this might lead to something bigger, I think is the key there. Okay. So there's another question about what happens if the partner does not want to do an RCT. People tend to be adverse to randomizing, especially government institutions. Yeah, so if they don't want to do an RCT, you can potentially do other types of research. So maybe you'd want to do something else with them. I mean, I think that the kind of the key takeaway from at least DigiFI's perspective is that we're keen to be funding proposals where there is a pathway to an RCT. So you might might want to reconsider that kind of opportunity and that research pathway if there isn't a strong willingness to randomize. Nidhi, I don't know if you have other thoughts or additions to that comment.
Yeah, I think it's the reality of how things are. Sometimes government are resistant to RCTs, and we completely understand that. And we don't believe that an RCT should be the solution to every single research question. We unfortunately only fund RCTs. So hopefully there are other opportunities where you can find funding for RCTs. And it also might help to work, if you do want to do an RCT, to help build relationships with them. So a proposal development or a pilot or doing data work for them, if you show that these projects have a pathway to a potential RCT, we could be open to funding them. We would need to see a pathway, but I think a lot of these things are based on relationships and whether they trust that this RCT will prove useful to them. So maybe that is one way around it.
Great. All right, we're running out of time, so we've got 2 more questions on the chat, and then I think we're going to close the session. But we have another question about what about if you intend to partner with the government as an implementing partner, yet you are an insider in evaluation? What would be the implications in terms of winning the proposal? Nidhi, do you want to answer that one? I mean,
sure. But Emily, did you want to add something to my last answer? Sorry.
Oh,
yeah, I just wanted to say that I think RCTs with government are certainly hard, but that's one reason that we want to find the governments who are interested to work here and to evaluate at large scale. And so what our hope is that you are on the ground building those relationships with governments and building that trust. And so if you have one of those relationships where the government says, yes, this is something that I want to do, that's extremely valuable. And I think then that really can help you unlock the ability to get research funding to support the government. I know from talking to many of our affiliates that many of them have their own relationships with governments where they are studying things at large scale that are very important to the government, but they're always looking for new partnerships where there's already an existing degree of trust with that government and there is the potential for doing a very large scale RCT. So if you have those relationships, that can be very valuable to you in coming in and working within the JPAL network and getting funding through DigiFI or from others for that. I also think that there's ways to frame RCTs to be more or less threatening to governments. Often when I'm working with governments, I will talk to them about how to answer design questions and to try to really listen to what their priorities are and what their questions are so that the study is designed to help them with their own priorities and around those design questions rather than be a evaluation of, are you doing a good job, yes or no? I think if you do that kind of study, then most governments will just say, no, I don't want to do that. But if you say, is it better to reach people through digital payments or through cash? And in what ways is that better? Then being able to phase in something new can be really helpful. And usually people roll things out in an iterative way anyway, because there's not the funding to do everybody at full scale at the beginning. And so if they're going to iterate and going to pull in a new intervention, then that's a great time to help them see a pathway towards a randomized trial. Sorry, I know I've gone over time now, but I thought that was a very important question. Thank you, guys. Now back to the question, I think, about being an insider in evaluations. Nidhi, to you.
Yeah, true, thank you. I think just, sorry, to go back to that question, to add to what Emily said, I think we do have quite a few resources on why RCTs are often a good solution to an evaluation method. And we would be happy to share that with you, think through the pros and cons of it and help you build a case for why an RCT and why you need to find a causal effect. Okay, now done with that question. And on the question on implementing partner and insider in evaluation, I think if you are, I'm not sure I can completely understand the question, but if you are, say, as part of the government who is implementing this policy, can you still be on the evaluation? The answer is yes. We try and look for government buy-in. We try and look for partners buy-in. And one very strong sign of buy-in is that they are on the project. Having said that, you just have to prove that there's academic integrity to the evaluation. So we would also look to make sure that even if you are part of the process, maybe there are other people on the project who are independent to the institution. So we are sure that the results that come through are objectively evaluated.
Great, thanks, Nidhi. And then the final question that we'll answer on verbally, although I'll type in the answers to the other two that have come through subsequently, is just if a small RCT is acceptable as a pilot, and if a pilot always requires a survey. And Nidhi, I'm gonna let you respond while I answer the other two on the chat.
Sure, thanks so much, Amy. A small RCT acceptable for a pilot? Yes, absolutely. I think so there are two things here. The question would be whether it is a pilot or an RCT. So as long as you have a sample size that's enough to show it's powered enough to show the outcomes that you want, in my mind, that is an RCT. I think if you're testing things out and you're still not sure about what outcomes you want to study in more detail, are you looking at the logistics of things? That's a pilot. There could very easily be randomization at a pilot stage. It's more of a question. I don't think this is a great answer to your question because it does depend on the case that you're looking at, but it is acceptable for a pilot, to my mind.
Just to add some substance there, I've seen... Sorry, Nidhi, you want to finish first?
No, go on. I'll answer the second part then.
Okay, I just want to say that I have seen examples of people who've done small RCTs using pilot funding from a different initiative, and they did like a small scale RCT. Maybe it was a bit underpowered because they couldn't do it at full scale, but then that built a relationship with JPAL affiliates, and then they ran very large scale RCTs after that was fully powered to be able to answer the question. But getting this experience with trying to run an RCT, even if it's smaller than what you might want to do in the future, that can be really, really beneficial, I think, and allow you to work through some of those details to be able to run bigger scale studies in the future. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. The second part of the question was about whether pilot always requires a survey. It's not set in stone. You don't have to have a survey, especially when people are using administrative data or using data that comes through technological appliances. You don't have to do so. But in most RCTs, you do have a survey because you don't get all the information you want from other sources. So I think there are very few cases where you wouldn't find one, but it isn't a necessary condition.
Great. I think Nidhi just cut out there at the end, but I think she was saying that it's not necessary, but it is helpful. Great. All right. I think our time is up. But thank you everybody for both participating on this call, joining us, and to Emily and Gabe for presenting. Yeah, so thank you for engaging with us today and over the last couple sessions. And if you have any other questions, you can email us directly at our email address, which should be, no, it's not on these slides, but you can, oh, there we go. You can email us if you have any other questions or comments. We're very, very happy to engage with everybody. Great. All right. I think that's us. Thank you so much. And have a good evening.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks Nidhi and Amy for organizing.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.